Okay. Sorry, I'm really sorry about that, everyone.
Okay, so I guess we can get started. Haley, do you want to say a couple of minutes about your paper?
Yeah, well, I'll keep it, of course, very short because what I'm most interested in is your feedback. So thank you so much for being willing to do this and for offering your comments and suggestions. I'm really looking forward to hearing them and working on how to improve the paper. I thought I would just say a very couple of brief things about the inspiration for the paper. So at a very basic level, I wanted to just try to collect some better data on when and where donors are willing to suspend aid. So as I try to articulate in the paper, I think that this is a really important aspect of political conditionality, but we just lack good data on when donors are willing to suspend aid, particularly on variations, I think, in their willingness to suspend. So theoretically, I was interested in testing the impact of organizational, or what I call in the paper, institutional incentives on aid suspensions. So I do a lot of in-country fieldwork in recipient countries, and I see firsthand how institutional features shape behavior and practices. And so in this paper, I was interested in identifying institutional features that might affect the willingness of donors to suspend aid. And the last thing I would just say is that the paper is part of a larger research agenda on commitment problems in foreign aid, both on the donor and the government side. So I have a forthcoming book on this project, which argues that the inability of donors and recipients to make credible commitments has important implications on the sustainability of aid delivery mechanisms. And a key part of that story is that donors have trouble committing to suspending aid. So in this paper, I really wanted to go in more in depth about why donor agencies struggle to credibly commit to suspensions. But I'll just leave it at that because I'm most interested in comments.
Okay, why don't we go in alphabetical order just to make things easier. So Sarah Bermeo, do you want to start?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so this is really interesting and obviously a topic that's of interest to all of us who are on the call now. So I thank you for stimulating the discussion. To kind of jump right in, so I see your main question. So you're looking at when donors are likely to sanction or suspend aid, and your part of this is motivated by the fact that this appears to occur even in politically or strategically important countries, where we might be least likely to expect that we would see it. And you lay out three kind of institutional incentives of donor agencies, as I'm understanding it. So direct effects on donor, when a scandal or something would have a direct effect on donor programming, if the recipient is actually receiving budget support, and that depends on the number of veto players that are present. So my comments kind of follow on each one of those things. So when thinking about changes in aid or whether aid is going to be sanctioned, I think it's important to have some understanding of what the baseline expectations of the donor are in the recipient. So, because not every recipient receives the same type of aid, right? And so you cite papers that that discuss that. And so if the donor has already built in the idea that this is a recipient where political repression takes place, where corruption is likely, where human rights are violated, they might be giving a type of aid that takes that into account. So they might already be bypassing the donor governments in order to give aid. And so now, if a country that I expect to suppresses political rights, I don't respond to it because that was already built into how I was giving aid. Mm-hmm. So then you would be thinking that donors would be more likely to respond to either unexpected levels of bad behavior or bad behavior that gets unexpected amounts of press, of attention, right? And so you mentioned bad press in your theory part, but it's not really part of the overall story that's tested in the empirics at all. But I would think that there has to be some kind of thought of what the expectations are. This also follows the same kind of train of logic follows, I think, when thinking about budget support, because budget support is not randomly distributed across recipient countries, right? And so if we're going to think about how donors are responding differently in budget support situations, I think we have to take into consideration that budget support situations, that there are characteristics of the recipients that are inherently different in budget support situations already. In which case, if I'm giving budget support to a country, it's probably because I think on average they're better governed than some other countries, right? And if I think that, then when they do something that convinces me otherwise, right, they behave in a way that convinces me that they aren't like that, then I'm more likely to actually update my beliefs about the recipient country, right? So I might be withdrawing budget support because I'm actually, updating. I thought this was a good type of country, and now I'm realizing it's not as good of a type of country. And so it's just kind of a natural response to changes in how we think about the country, as opposed to changes, as opposed to a response to a particular event coming. The other thing about budget support is it's much easier to stop and restart. I mean, I've done interviews in the field too, and that was one of the things when I was down in Central America, that I was down there at a time when a lot of European countries were switching over to budget support, and that was one of the things that was concerning them, was that it was going to be much harder to get back into project aid if they cut off budget support. So there is this kind of transition period. If you decide a country's not good for budget support anymore, it takes time to revamp up the project level aid, right? So there's going to be a lag time there. And some donors might decide that it's not worth it at that point, right? Some of them were stepping back because they didn't want the administrative overhead of doing, and they were doing budget support because they didn't want the administrative overhead of doing the project-based aid. When it comes to multilateral versus bilateral, I would encourage you to give the reader some sense of how you think the different makeup of multilateral and bilateral aid might matter, in the sense that most, or at least a lot, of multilateral aid is loan-based, whereas a lot of bilateral aid is grant-based. And there's probably different capabilities of cutting off a loan in which the government is actually a partner who has signed on to the loan and agreed to pay it back, than there are to cutting off grant money that is just kind of given without the sense that it's going to be paid back, and so might be easier to just shut off. As well as, I mean, you point out at one point early in the paper, organizations like the World Bank aren't allowed to take certain criteria into account that some bilateral agencies do take into account. So that could explain part of your difference there. I would say that I think what I would love to see you do is kind of couple this survey work that you've done with some empirical analysis of actual changes in foreign aid. And you mentioned at the end, because all along I was kind of thinking this, I was like, why don't you just actually measure this? And you mentioned at the end that you don't want to do this because looking at sanctions would involve selecting on the dependent variable. I think you can set up a regression where that's not true, where what you're looking at are actual changes in aid, right? Where that's your dependent variable, and then you're putting things in on the right-hand side that measure the type of things you care about, like political repression or human rights or corruption, whether or not these things were specific to a project or otherwise, which would probably require some look at, press accounts or something like that. In which case, if you wanted to go that way and kind of blow the project up bigger, you could look at press accounts in the donor country. Did this thing all of a sudden get a lot of attention that it hadn't been getting before? And there are softwares that you can use to kind of analyze content analysis of maybe the relevant newspapers, which would be, I don't know how many languages you speak, but obviously you speak English. So in the English-speaking donor countries, that might be possible. Kind of on that same line, when you talk about budget support, you seem to be relying on the survey responses, and yet we have data on who actually gets budget support. So you wouldn't need to rely on survey responses for that. You could actually pull that out. And I'll leave it there, and I hope that some of my colleagues will comment more on the list experiment, because I haven't actually ever performed one, and so I don't want to go too far out on the limb in commenting on the empirics of that, but I'm sure that there are empirics there that others might be able to jump in on. Okay.
All right, thanks, Sarah. I'll move over to the other Sarah.
Okay, great. So thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I thought this was a really fascinating and pretty polished, very polished paper. I agreed that the research question on what causes donors to suspend aid is very important for the literature on foreign aid effectiveness. And I really appreciated the paper's effort in getting into the sort of nitty-gritty of how aid works and the salient variations that you uncovered in donor agencies that previous research hasn't looked at. And I also want to commend the empirical effort that went into the project. Although survey experiments we see this kind of work increasingly in international relations. It's quite rare that we see IR survey work that employs this kind of expert sample, since it takes so much effort to create such a sample. So I really appreciated that work that you put in and the way that you take advantage of the unique sample of top level donor representatives. So I'm going to organize my comments in 4 themes. I have some other points which I can share with you offline. I think some of my comments overlap with what Sarah has raised, but maybe I'll put them in my own way. So my first comment is that even after trying to read the paper quite carefully, I remained a bit confused about how you were defining aid suspensions and the mechanics of how aid suspensions work. Once you got into the discussion of the different types of bilateral agencies, that helped me, but I still needed more help. And I think fundamentally, what I was confused about is that aid suspensions, I understood them as either being about cutting off aid that's only partially transferred or dispersed, or in terms of cutting off some sort of program in the future. And your theory, I read it as primarily being about cutting off aid that was partially given but not completely given. But to me, the more colloquial understanding of suspending aid does encompass more of this notion of not giving more aid in the future. And I think that more clarity is needed in the paper on this point for a couple of reasons. One, and this I think is something that the previous discussant also raised, not all aid really can be suspended. And so if you're talking, if you mean aid in terms of suspending aid in terms of just cutting off something that's only partially been given, as was mentioned, well, that depends on the type of aid, the length of the project, other features of the donor agency, some of these features, which you do already discuss in your argument, but others of which you don't. But it seems like if you're talking about just not giving aid in the future, then there are many more possibilities for suspension. So I think it's useful to have this clear theoretically and empirically. I wasn't sure what people might have been thinking about when they were taking your survey, because you're asking them about suspending aid in the future. So do you have any sense from the qualitative work that you've done of how people would have understood this? And what they thought you might have meant when you asked them about aid? Would that have been all aid, some aid? If so, which types? Okay. So then my second comment is that there seems to be an assumption in the paper that aid suspensions after political transgressions are effective ways to bring about better behavior in the future. And I would like you to make the case that we know that that's true based on maybe the literature on sanctions or other literatures. And I would like to see the paper do more to talk about what other types of tools of punishment donors can use. Maybe it's the case that aid agencies don't intend to invoke suspensions more than they do because suspensions are difficult for the reasons, some of the reasons we've already discussed, because they have negative consequences for the people in the countries where aid is being given, et cetera. Maybe other strategies would work better. So I think we need to know more about them in the context of this paper. My third comment has to do with the principal agent problem in your theory, in which the strategic interests of the donor government clash with the institutional incentives of the donor agency. Now, I'm totally sympathetic to the idea that there are these kinds of principal agent problems in foreign assistance, and yet, despite that, I feel like you haven't sufficiently demonstrated the clash in interest yet. So it seems to me that a donor government might be worried about bad press for all of the same reasons that, or many of them, that a donor agency would be. And even if, yes, a donor government has some political interest in a country, it's not clear to me that the donor government would actually want to continue certain types of aid in the aftermath of a major corruption scandal involving its aid. It seems to me that a donor government that is concerned about aid effectiveness should be worrying about these things too. It's not just the special interests of the bureaucrats that are working at donor agencies that necessarily push this kind of thinking. So I would like to see a stronger case be made for this clash in interests if you're going to be really emphasizing the principal agent logic so much. Or alternatively, I wonder if you don't need a principal agent argument in your in this paper's theory section. It can still be the case that a donor agency would be more likely to suspend aid in the aftermath of certain types of scandals, even if it's not because of agency slack. Okay, and then my final comment is more of an empirical comment. So I would, and it pertains to your vignette questions. So I would like you to at least acknowledge the potential for confounding in these questions, which is to say that people might be inferring other things about the countries when they try to when they try to imagine that a country is having a major corruption scandal or a highly fraudulent election. This kind of event might bring with it all sorts of other updating about the country in general. And so I think that it would behoove you to discuss some of the other changes that typically accompany the events that you're discussing in isolation in the vignettes, and what those other changes might mean for people's beliefs about the appropriateness of aid suspensions. I think you already have done a lot in terms of your survey work in this paper, and it's not that helpful to say, okay, imagine a whole nother survey, go out and do that. I know that that's not an easy thing to do, but I think that there could be some space, at least in the conclusion, to talk about what kinds of alternative research designs you might propose that could better nail down the causal mechanisms, that could address some of the concerns about confounding. I think at a minimum, help the reader think through what else you could do to identify the relationships you're interested in, even if you can't get at it. You can't do everything in the context of one paper. So I'll leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone over my time too much. And yeah, I look forward to talking about it more later.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And Martin, are you ready?
Yeah. So let me also say thank you for this this opportunity. I think it's a great format to focus on one paper. So this is the first time I'm doing this, so this is great. I enjoyed the paper a lot. In particular, I think the focus on aid agencies is really important, timely. We know really little about it, and in my own work, I encountered that void, and it's hard to fill. So I want to really give you kudos for that. Obviously, you did a lot of field work, which is also fantastic. And I have to say, so from the empirical side, I don't have much to add, partly because you're not in the design stage, right? And I don't do list experiments myself. So from my understanding of the survey work, I was really, I learned a lot reading it, and I really liked it. Where my comments are going to focus on is taking a little bit on Sarah's, following in their footsteps there on the theoretical side, maybe on the framing. So the first one is I had like Sarah, I can't even say Sarah B, so Sarah Bush. I had a similar reaction to her when I concerning the principal agent theory that you build your argument around, and so actually the same reaction, because even some of the examples you cite about NORAD in Norway sort of covering up corruption, I had this reaction thinking like, yes, they are covering this up. It's good for them, but it's also good basically for they really covering up for the policy. And the policy was agreed on the government on the policy level by their principal. So they sort of cover for the principal. So it would have. So a lot of these examples that are in your paper, which are interesting, but this press coverage, all this embarrassment, to me primarily is political embarrassment, and political embarrassment really affects the agency as it does the principal of the government. Now, I think you can probably have this in there, but you would have to add something to make clear where the interests between the agency and the principal diverge. And that really speaks to the justification for hypothesis 1. In hypothesis 1, you basically say, right, you basically say that if the aid portfolio is affected, then the agency will punish more, but and you justify this with this embarrassment factor. But there are other things that are really threatening to the agency as an agency that are apart from what the government wants. And so this is basically things like they need to show their ability to do what they were chosen to do, such as monitoring programs, right? That's their job, such as basically demonstrating basic competency in setting targets, all these kinds of things. So these are genuine agency concerns which would motivate them to sort of cover up, for example, the tracks in the NORAD case, because yes, it is a political liability for everyone, but it actually really poorly reflects on their on the implementation side. So I think you can infuse this argument with more of a genuine principal agent rationale. And then I think moving on to hypothesis 2, for budget support, you don't need that argument. And I agree with Sarah Bush there. You don't even need that there because it's a political embarrassment, right? Budget support is a highly politicized issue, and so therefore it's the political reaction, and that's exactly also tying in with what Sarah Bermeo was saying, because we would expect that budget aid is fueled by a different policy intent than other types of aid, right? So there is a certain self-selection. I was struck. So when you talk about the veto player argument, I was struggling a little bit with that, and I had a sense that you actually in the past might have encountered that criticism because you address it, right? It's a very unexpected argument in a way, because we like to think that multilateral agencies are less politicized, right? That's like your standard rationale. You go multilateral, sort of like clean your hands of political pressure, and so you try to build an opposite case. And I think that's fine, that's insightful, but there is at least one alternative explanation that comes to my mind. So you have this, this ranking of being most to least sensitive to pressures for suspension. And it is impossible that multilaterals sort of suspend less because they are not embarrassed politically as much if something goes wrong in their allocation, in what the recipient does, as, for example, a minister of foreign aid who has to sort of stand up in cabinet when the bad news hits the fan, right? There is, in a way, the multilateral agency is more removed, is more protected from this type of constituency blowback, right? It goes then, of course, back to the voter in the bilateral setting, and who is the constituent of, who is the principal of the multilateral. It's more, more abstract. I'm not saying that this is the only thing that's what's going on. I think what your story is plausible, but I think it's at least potentially a parallel story. Again, that I think is also a theoretical claim. It doesn't really mean that your still fits your data, but it's just a different story that could fit that same data. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I hope I don't go too much over time here, is, and this goes back, this is actually also ties in with what Sarah Bermeo was saying. You emphasize the clash between strategic and bureaucratic incentives, but then in your empirical part, there's nothing about strategic interests, right? So I wasn't entirely sure if you need it, but the setting up this clash between strategic and agency sort of seems that you have a conditional argument, right? So this only bureaucratic incentives only seem to matter then if there's a strategic incentive. But so I just wonder if it's worth it. I'm not entirely sure what the theoretical implications, but I wonder if it's worth it to break down maybe some of what your data by strategic status of the recipient country and see if there's variation there. And that sort of goes along the lines with, I think, what Sarah was saying, Meho was saying, self-selection of aid facility, right? So you have a very different idea when you give budget aid, maybe in terms, so I don't know. I mean, so that's something just what I want to suggest you could think about, because it's in your theory and then in the empirical part it completely drops out. Those are all my comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. All right, Joe.
Okay, great. So yeah, I really enjoyed reading this paper. I never think about the donors and their issues, so it's nice to learn. And I think about the recipients. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I appreciate the list experiment. I'm a sucker for those, so I buy the logic. I think it's such a powerful logic that I tend to buy those that evidence. So okay, let me go to the theory, and this is going to touch a little bit on maybe some of the stuff other folks have already raised. So I guess what I was missing was you've got this institutional incentives story, and I would just, if I'm going to tell this story about what donors are going to do, there's lots of different things out there that could influence them. So obviously strategic is the big one. Normative is another big one. And in the design of the vignettes and the list and stuff, I guess I wasn't seeing that stuff embedded in there. And so I think that's like part of the larger story. So you've got really big, what looked to me like really big size effects here. I mean, some of those differences in proportions or differences in means are just huge. And so, I think there's more to the story you've got there. And this is sort of like unfair comment because it's, but how is this embedded in the strategic story? How is this embedded in a normative story? And I think you need to be, I think you can actually, address that normative story and just dismiss it in some level by saying, this is what they're likely to do, not what you want them to do. And that sort of gets you around the normative story. But the strategic story, that you can't escape that story or that logic. And so their institutional incentives are embedded in that larger strategic story. And my guess is what goes on is there's some sort of interaction that's going on. Because when those donors or those whoever they are, the representatives of the donor agencies, when they're answering that question, they're not thinking about this, all else equal with respect to the strategic environment that they're operating in terms of who what their governments are wanting strategically out of the recipients. Okay, so alternative logics that came up that I was like, oh, if I'm actually so strategic, I think might be an interaction. But if I'm one of these donor people and I'm trying to sort of think about when I'm going to sanction stuff, one that Sarah Bush, I think this is her number 2 comment, but one that I thought, well, would this work? Is sanctioning even effective? Let's say we want to get them to stop political transgressing. Is this even on the map as being effective? And maybe it's not. And so then therefore, I don't even have an incentive the bureaucratic incentive or the institutional incentives don't even kick in because nobody thinks this is going to matter. And maybe that's not a story, and you just need to convince me that's not a story. It's just not relevant. But the other, and this actually I think is where your the empirical design or the questions get at could also be picking up this logic. So I think you can deal with the strategic logic. I think you can dismiss my normative comments, and the efficacy stuff. I think addressing a little bit more would be helpful. But here's where the real kicker is, and I think so you've got this this donor representative who's observing something observing the political transgression. Okay, now political transgressions are contested evidence in almost all cases. And so, here I'm thinking about, let's go back to election violence, related violence in Cote d'Ivoire or Kenya. And basically you've got donors and donor governments, and whether it's not USAID, it's the State Department, trying to actually referee the evidence for the political transgressions, right? They're the ones who are actually saying, oh yeah, this wasn't fraudulent, this was fraudulent. And so transgression is not independent of the donor's strategic interest. I guess is how I would phrase it. And so some things, like here I'm thinking, and this is the example I always go back to, whether or not the recipient holds or cancels a multi-party election, like you really can't fudge that, right? Everybody knows that Joseph Kabila is not having an election right now. And everybody will know when they do have a multi-party election. Okay, there's really no way to sort of fudge that. But it's a contested election. Was there fraud? Like, you know, different people have different narratives about that. And so when I see something like the alternatives A through G in the questions, and then you get really big differences for like really fraudulent election and not so fraudulent election. Well, part of what be going on is actually the level of fraud, but it could also be that when there's really fraudulent elections, there's basically no contestation about the narrative of whether this was fraudulent. And so what's going on is like the donors may be like, well, I can't really sanction because the narrative about whether there's actually a transgression is contested. Whereas in other cases, when it's just so blatant and everyone can agree that it's contested, or that there's been a transgression and that and there's no disagreement over that. So this gets back to like, you're a donor and you have different kinds of things entail different monitoring costs. You know, and that's where the budget support comes in, is like when if there's corruption in the agency that you are dealing with, or in the budget, like you're closely attuned to that, right? As a donor agency, you're dealing with like, you're giving money to, let's say, the judicial sector or some sector in the recipient country. And so you're totally paying attention to that. And then there's corruption over there in the environmental ministry. Okay, but you're not giving environmental aid. So your monitoring costs for environmental corruption are very different than your monitoring costs for judicial corruption, because that's what you're paying attention to. And so what you might be getting there is not just strategically like, I want to cover my portfolio. I won't use the colorful language, but actually like reflecting the monitoring costs of the actual donor. And so right now in the vignettes, like I can't distinguish between these institutional incentives, or maybe it's just an alternative way of interpreting the institutional incentives, but it is basically reflective of the monitoring costs involved there. And I don't know if there's a way you can, I'm not too creative, but in a way to distinguish between the monitoring cost logic that I've offered and the institutional incentives that you're offering. And maybe it's just a different way of interpreting institutional incentives. Okay, real quick, in the empirics. So I don't study donor agencies, so maybe my comments here are really naive. All right, when you're studying different types of, or categorizing different types of donor agencies, those that are embedded in a presidential system, donor system, and here I'm basically thinking of the U.S., but basically you've got different branches of government. They're going to have different strategic interests. So way back, dated example here, but basically Congress was able to cut off funding in the mid 1970s to Chile for political transgressions. But then Nixon came back in and kicked in his stuff because he had a different set of strategic interests. And so you just need to tell me, someone like me, that that your veto players is picking up the difference between presidential and parliamentary systems. Because, and I don't study this stuff, but you know, the gross assumption that people like me make is that parliamentary systems, the executive and the legislature are basically almost always aligned because they're kind of the same. Whereas in the presidential systems, you can get more divided governments. Just tell me that that's what you're picking up in your measure. Okay, and this may be a silly comment because I don't understand and do surveys, but I look at those response rates and I say, okay, 50% is fine, or 53%. Question is, does this vary by type of agency? Just tell me they don't, or show me they don't. Because otherwise, if they do, then that's going to tell me a little bit about why I'm going to get such different responses potentially. If there's systematic differences in the response rates by the type of donor agency, or even by the type of cross-sectionally, like for the time period you're studying, there's pretty decent cross-sectional data on sort of national level corruption. Is the response rates differing a lot by corruption or by human rights scores or something like that? But just show me that there's nothing systematically off about your response rates. Okay, I think that's all my comments. But I really enjoyed doing this, reading this, and appreciated learning. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I had one question to build off something that Sarah Bush said. So I was just wondering, in what order did you do the list experiment and then the, what do you call the scenario questions about suspensions? Because I don't know a whole lot about surveys, but I'm wondering if people who received the list experiment and who saw the aid suspensions were primed to already be thinking about suspensions, and if that's going to affect how they respond to scenarios. So I think it would be easy to just do like a crosstab of the people who received the question about suspending aid in the list experiment to see if they were more likely to suspend aid in scenarios in general, but it might be helpful to do that. Okay, so I guess Haley, you've received a lot of feedback, so you can have 5 to 10 minutes to respond and raise questions if you want. And
Yeah, well, thank you very much. This is all really helpful, and I'll go through it also, I mean, of course, afterwards, and maybe in touch with you about specific questions about different points, because it's, of course, a lot to take in at the moment. I think one thing that I hear as I'm kind of going through is that, and one thing I've really struggled with throughout this paper is once I feel as in some ways that I open kind of Pandora's box, right? So that aid suspensions are complicated and they happen for a variety of different reasons, and I want to get at some institutional factors or some broad features. But of course, my survey and kind of the data that I'm collecting can never really fully capture the complexities of the situation. And so I see a lot of your points as being as pointing to important factors that I totally agree with matter. And so some of the struggles that I face throughout this paper is figuring out, okay, what are the things that I can kind of systematically address with the data that I do have? What are things that I need to leave for another paper in terms of if I want to do some more survey work around this? And then what are things that also need some qualitative work to kind of figure things out? I think I'll just go through a few of the different comments. In terms of the first comments about the baseline expectations of donors, I think this is a really important point, and I'm thinking that it just really needs to be much clearer in the paper. Kind of what are some baseline expectations in terms of suspensions? I'll have to think about exactly where I want to position myself on that, and kind of what evidence we have to draw those expectations. But I think that that's a really good suggestion. In terms of budget support, I think that this is an interesting question, or an interesting, because of course budget support, I totally agree, is not randomly distributed. So certain organizations, so the German government, for example, you know, if you're at the bottom 25% in terms of kind of Transparency's international corruption indexes, you just don't get budget support because you've already been blacklisted, so to say. On the other hand, I do think that budget support is often, I mean, if we look at where budget support was given, it was primarily given in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. It was given to kind of low-income countries that did not necessarily have maybe as much protection or accountability practices in place. So I think that while it's not randomly distributed, on the other hand, we sometimes do overestimate that donors are making calculations based on the conditions of the country. At least what I see from some of my qualitative evidence is that budget support is often given because it gives donors access. So it gives them leverage at the recipient country level. It allows them to sit at the table and to talk about high-level political issues. But I think that it's an important thing, and I also think that the point in terms of saying, you know, I ask in the survey whether or not they've given budget support, but of course we do have data on kind of what they've actually given. So to go back and kind of cross-check that and to use that data and to draw on that as well. I think this point about making sense of how each varies, so multilateral aid is mainly loan versus bilateral, is a really important one. I just need to delve into it a little bit more. As well as in terms of the World Bank isn't kind of allowed to actually take into account certain things. I think that that's actually relatively consistent with my story around veto players. But I actually maybe will address that in a moment when I talk about Sarah Bush's comments. just looking at Sarah's, your comments, this question about how to define aid suspensions, I realized as you were talking that you're exactly right. So I define aid suspensions as, you know, aid that has already been promised and then has been cut off. And that comes from my research, which has really been focusing on commitment problems, right? So it's been focusing on promises that have already been made and the credibility of those promises. But you're right that this part of political conditionality is much broader in terms of also thinking about promises in the future. And so what I got from your comments is just that needs to be very explicit in the beginning, that's really what I'm focusing on. And this question that was raised a couple of times about whether or not aid suspensions are actually effective, I don't think I'm assuming, well, I'm at least not in my own thinking assuming that aid suspensions can actually be effective. What I think I am assuming is that they won't be effective if they can't actually credibly promise to suspend. So in part, the first step to kind of understanding whether or not they're effective is to understand whether a credible promise to suspension can actually be made. But I can be much more explicit about that. So in terms of the debate about principal agents, I'd really like to hear more of your thoughts, and also some people that didn't weigh in on it, kind of how they can weigh in, because it is something I've kind of struggled with, how much to rely on some of that logic throughout the paper. And in different versions, there's been more of it in there, and in other versions, there's been less of it in there. And I got that, you know, Sarah, you were saying, well, maybe you don't really need it. And then others were saying, well, I actually think it's important, just kind of vamp it up a little bit. So maybe for those that didn't weigh in on it, if people have comments, I'd be really appreciative of that. Going on to, let's see, just looking through some of these alternative explanations. And I think that some of the points that were also raised here in terms of how to use the data. I mean, one thing that I've really struggled with in terms of the data is that there's I think it provides a really interesting set of information and an interesting set of data, but I have respondents from 114 hawks, right? I can't break it down in many of the ways that I would like to break it down, because the sample size just become way too small when I start to do that. And that causes, so there's a lot of things that I would love to be able to test with this data that I can't, because I don't have the volume in terms of responses. Sarah, you mentioned, well, I don't know if you want to go out and do this. So I've definitely thought about collecting more and more data and doing another survey. And I think I've learned a lot from that. So in many ways, so some of these is trying to figure out what I'll use to change the paper, and then what I'll use to put into another survey in which I can try to test some of these things out. Because there, I think I would want to first of all go beyond Africa, but I would also want to have much larger sample sizes so I can test some of these different variations. I don't want to take up. I just kind of go through. I won't take up too much time, but I think. Some of the suggestions that were made in the last comments about distinguishing between presidential and parliamentary, I think those are really important and important things that I can put in there and boost my case quite easily. Also, with the response rates don't vary by agencies. So I have looked at all of that, and there isn't anything that I'm worried about there. So I can definitely put that in to reassure the reader. I think I'll leave it at that, just as I want to get the most feedback from you.
All right, thanks. I guess we'll open the floor back up to discussants. So does anybody have anything to build on? So Sarah Bermeo.
Okay, great. Well, this has been a really, really interesting discussion. Building on a few things, I really liked Joe Wright's, well, I guess I can say Joe, which doesn't need a last name, Joe's comments about thinking about interactions, how these things interact with each other. And I think there's, a few different ways you can do that. One is by having some control for the strategic importance of the countries interacted with these other variables. And so, things like arms transfer data or something like that, because it could maybe start to build in some of the strategic importance. I don't particularly like UN voting similarity, because I think it could go either way, though there are people in the literature who use that. And then I think, have you, in terms of baselines, have you thought about controlling for, the lagged measure of corruption or human rights or political assassinations or things that we have data for that might say, oh, well, if we're already operating in a country that we know is highly corrupt, right, then we would expect things, the fact that they continue to be highly corrupt isn't a surprise to us. And so, or even controlling for changes in level of corruption or human rights or something like that, just to get at this kind of, is the country behaving differently than expected? And also thinking, when Sarah Bush was talking about what do aid sanctions, what does it really mean? And I think that's also, I think it's an important question. It's important to clarify just what you mean by it. It's also important to think about what people who you were asking questions to might have thought about it, because it's one thing to cut off budget support but move it into project aid, and it's another to just completely decrease the amount of aid to a country or stop a project that is already in process. And all of those things could be interpreted at some level as a sanction, right? Moving from less desirable budget support to project aid is a sanction of a sort, but it might not decrease the total amount of aid. So it's not clear how that would be interpreted. And then a last comment on budget support, it also differs across donors. The propensity to give, the likelihood of giving budget support differs across donors, and maybe in ways that interact with some of these other things that you think are characteristics of donors, right? So the US is much less likely to give budget support than our, say, parliamentary European systems, right? And so that might be something that you want to think about as well. And it was kind of coming to my mind hearing the other comments.
Okay, thanks. Do any of the other discussants have anything to add? Yeah, Haley, do you want to respond?
Yeah, because this question of this interaction between strategic and institutional is something that I've struggled with throughout the paper, in the sense that, I mean, of course, part of the argument I want to be advancing is that institutional incentives matter as well. But I'm not in any way trying to say that strategic interests don't matter. And so I think these suggestions about some of these controls I can put in, but if anyone has there certainly have been some that I can look back through, but if people have more thoughts on that, that's something that I've really struggled with throughout the project, is how to figure out kind of when one is happening and when the other isn't happening, because I think that they are actually so tightly linked, and that I want to make a case that we should care about institutional incentives, but I don't want to do that by having to say, well, strategic incentives don't matter. I mean, I think that's putting up a straw man that that's a battle that I'm not going to win, because it's also a battle that it's not something I agree with. So those suggestions are really helpful. And if anyone has any more thoughts on that, that would be also greatly appreciated.
All right, Joe?
Sorry. One route is to go Sarah Bomero's route and take the objective information that you get on arms transfers or, military aid. That seems sensible to me. Another is just actually, and this is that unfair, like go back and redesign the questionnaire, but to go back and think about how you would, and even if you don't actually have the data on it, but to actually talk about it in the conclusion or a discussion about what it would look like to actually embed, and I don't know how you do this in a survey, but embed the question somehow in there. Because the thing that I was left with at the end of this is, wow, those are huge size effects for some of those things. When you've got like 70% on one and 12% on the other, like those are just, wow, big effects in my mind. And so I want to know what was the size of those relative to the strategic stuff? I mean, you're sort of saying, I'm not dismissing the strategic, and I don't think you were at all. But I also want to know how this matters, like in terms of either the size or the interaction. And so, one route would be to just sort of wave your hands a little bit and say, well, if the strategic is like overriding, then we wouldn't expect to see these effects at all. And if it interacts in this way, then we'd expect to see these effects. So just sort of, I don't know if there's a way to sort of get around it by just sort of laying out for the reader what the expectations would be if we saw strategic interactions, strategic incentives interacting with the institutional, or what we would expect the size of the strategic incentives to be in these different cases. Or I don't know if there's a way to leverage differences in donors in terms of their strategic stuff, like the multilateral versus the bilateral stuff, right? I don't know, you guys answer these questions, not me, but aren't multilaterals supposed to be less strategic when it comes to like some of this stuff than the bilaterals who have to like, you know, go to that to their or to their legislature to get funding, kind of thing. But yeah, more in the discussion about what that design would look like, what we'd expect to find.
Joe just disappeared. Sarah, did you have Sarah Bush, did you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I had a couple of other comments that I can throw out there that they go in different directions than what we've, I think, just been talking about, but I'll just throw them out there. Anyhow, so one thought that I had is that, you know, the concept of transgressions that directly affect the aid portfolio is another concept that I remain a bit fuzzy on. I sort of bought your classification of different types of transgressions once you walked me through it, but I'm not confident that if you presented me with a bunch of different scenarios that I could use your conceptualization to sort of identify them. And so I think there's more that you can and should say about what you mean by that concept and to help us better understand how you operationalize it. And sort of relatedly, I guess you have what, seven different transgressions that you ask about in your survey vignettes. And I would like to better understand why those are the ones that you ask about. There are other things that, you know, you could have, other transgressions that you could have asked about. It's a little bit mushy right now, and I think you would benefit from more explanation. Although, of course, how you want to deal with this depends on the way you respond to the principal agent problems. Because I mean, I guess the highly fraudulent election result doesn't fit into this, but one way that you could understand this concept is it seems to often just be a distinction between kind of corruption problems and other types of political transgressions. That's one way that I understood the concept sometimes. So I don't know, maybe that's another way to define it. I had another just totally unrelated comment, which is that I was thinking, so I guess everybody that's on the call is working one way or another on issues of foreign aid, and the paper right now is pitched very much as being about speaking to the foreign aid literature, and that's fine, good, but it seems to me that you might have the topic of suspensions is something that we don't know a lot about how that works in other types of conditionality, and you have the potential maybe to say something to larger debates on this topic. So I know there's some work that Felicity Vabulis is doing right now about conditionality in IOs. You could also think about, suspensions and IO membership. You could also think about suspensions and types of diplomatic relations. And I guess the very micro level of the argument maybe doesn't allow you to speak that well to these other topics, but you might consider if there's something that we can learn from this study beyond foreign aid to the dynamics of conditionality writ large.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. And Martin? Unmute.
So I wanted to follow up on what Sarah just said. So one study that actually came to my mind about suspensions is Randy Stone's work on IMF program suspensions, and so maybe just that might be just a source of how to how to think about it in a sense, because he clearly distinguishes between the principal and the agent and the length of the suspension, all these kind of things. It's very fine-grained, and it's just that would be one of the venues to relate it to a larger audience, going beyond the foreign aid audience. I mean, personally, I'm of course fine with foreign aid, but I think it's a good point for a sales pitch. And I wanted to also come back one more time to the principal agent thing, and some of the things that Joe said. So far, I think the debate has really focused on how to bring strategy in terms of empirics. But I think that also this actually goes back to your theoretical framing, because if you really care about, and I think that you do want to make the case that agency politics or agency dynamics are separate from the overall strategic motivation. And so in that sense, and the way you frame this is that agency incentives afford you a wedge to sort of play a part when does strategy override things that you would do, and when does it not override them. And I think you could lay this out more clearly, because I was just like doodling and thinking like, okay, so what exactly is it that you predict? If a recipient is a strategic recipient, strategically important recipient, or strategically not important recipient, in both cases, we probably will reach a level on which we probably at some level we will suspend. But it's really about the agency interest that that makes it harder to suspend, right? So that's the basic story, and so that's basically what Joe. I think that's Joe what you have in mind with the interaction design that you talked about, right? But I don't see it really spelled out in those terms in the theory. I think you could just sharpen that aspect, because then, especially especially since right now the way it is, there is no clear distinction between the agency, what the agency wants, and how it could be really substantively different from what the donor wants. Sort of the things that what I mentioned before. And so there needs to be something that you actually really have that wedge to play these two interests apart. So really be specific where they separate.
Okay, Haley, do you want to respond to the additional comments you received?
I was actually thinking when I was going over them that, so one final question I would have for you is, so if I was to do another survey again, and if I was to ask people, what are the types of things that you would put on that survey? What are the types of questions that you want? I mean, one thing I'm hearing is that I could imagine certainly designing a question that's, first of all, just better designed at getting about this wedge between strategic interest and institutional issues. But are there also other things? I mean, while I have you and once you've read the paper, I kind of would, I guess, use your talents a little bit and just ask you, what are the types of things that if I was to do this again, you would ask people? Do you have certain ideas or suggestions there?
Okay, Martin, I guess you can start.
So the one thing I really found fascinating about your work is that you talk to the folks who are actually in the country, in the field, right? And in my own work, I have talked to folks who sit in Paris or in Bonn. And I just would be really curious to see how much slippage there is between these entities, because the higher ups in the agency, they have a different perspective on things than the people in the field. The other thing is that you might want to include is just in terms of actually gathering basic information. I know in the German case, there is actually a mechanism built in how you can do suspension that's pretty, as far as I know, pretty unique, because the BMZ is the only German ministry that doesn't need annual authorization of budgets in the budget plan, but gets like a 3-year or 4-year block. And what they told me in my interviews, they told me they actually can use this to sort of strategically spread out how the money is leaving the account over 3 to 4 years. So they can actually hold up some money without actually losing the money, right? And so if that's, I just don't know anything about this for the German case. It's clearly not the case for the US, obviously. This is like there's the least leverage, but there's clearly a source of variation. I wouldn't be worried about for you particular design, but it would be really just interesting to know, because if these agencies have different tools how to affect suspension, that could be an important aspect of this.
Sarah Bush?
Yes, well, I also saw Joe, so I don't want to. I'll go ahead and speak, but I'm sorry if I preempted you, Joe. So something that occurs to me is that if you had another a chance to do a survey, that this would be well suited for kind of a conjoint research design, where basically you could specify to your interviewees a number of characteristics of the aid in question, which I think speaks to a bunch of the comments that have been raised. So, you know, if you're giving them scenarios where they could decide to suspend aid or not suspend aid, you know, you can have it be budget or not budget. You can have it be a large amount of aid or a small amount of aid. You can, and then you can also have specified the some traits of the countries and the transgressions, and I think you could also specify something about the nature of the relationship between the donor agency and the donor government. And I think you know, you can have this kind of conjoint design, and you can ask people to answer many of these kinds of scenarios, even though you're still going to be in your smaller, you know, sample, right? And to me, I think if you had the chance, something like this would be interesting to try, in part because, well, so I don't know so much about the HOCs, but in general, you know, people who are working in aid agencies are working in many different countries, right, over the course of their careers. I assume this is the same for even for the really high level individuals. And so and they may even in some cases, work for a bilateral and a multilateral. And so they have experience, right, working in lots of different contexts. So I don't think that I think you could ask them to imagine different scenarios and maybe not restrict them just to the country where they're working. So that, to me, that would be, you know, a great complement to this research agenda. If you had the opportunity to do something like that, you know, it would be a really cool second paper.
Sorry, Joe. I guess now you can.
All right. Yeah, sure. Last thought here is like, so I don't know if this is, you can actually do this in a survey for the people who do surveys. If this is like, you can't even ask these questions. But so if you're going to do vignettes, you know, a vignette where you say the incumbent government says there was no fraud and the opposition says there was fraud, but your foreign ministry says no transgression, and then have one where it's the same thing. The domestic government says, the incumbent government says no fraud, the opposition says fraud, but your foreign ministry says yes, there was fraud. Okay. Ask how many times are you aware of, like, how many times a French general has come to visit Cote d'Ivoire, or an American general? Are you aware of whether or not France sells arms to Cote d'Ivoire? Just ask those questions straight up. That's what I would do to get at the strategic stuff.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Sarah Bermeo, did you have anything?
Sure. So the one thing that has occurred to me is before I would put a whole nother survey in the field, I would start with some more in-depth interviews, which I'm sure you probably have already done, but now you might ask different questions than what you had asked before, and start with some in-depth interviews with very open-ended questions, right? So that will allow you to get to some of these strategic issues or these baseline issues, or so you'll know which country you're operating in, right? You'll know, and you'll be asking questions to people in that country. You'll know what their baseline levels of corruption are. You'll know how that compares to other countries. And now you can ask, you know, well, if a corruption scandal was uncovered tomorrow, what would happen, right? I mean, and maybe they'll say, oh, we would switch from budget support to other aid, or we would dial back on aid, or we wouldn't do anything, right? We've already considered that, and that's why we don't. That's why we're not channeling any, you know, money through that agency. And you could then you could ask about specific agencies, you know. So if it's a country that isn't doing, somebody had brought up the example of environment, right? If it's a country where they're not doing any environmental aid, now there's a corruption that's environment related, you know, corruption in the environment agency, does that actually have an effect on aid at all? So I would ask some open-ended questions that then would help you to design, possibly, you know, before you go kind of full out and do a survey, just go back and some of your best contacts, you know, ask some questions. I also, agree with Sarah Bush's point about, I mean, when I was doing field research, so I did mine in Central America, a lot of the people I interviewed had served in Africa or other countries, and they love to compare. And actually budget support was a big thing because Latin America was lagging way behind in terms of receiving budget support, and the people working there had no idea why, like in terms of corruption or things like that, right? These countries are no worse than African countries who are getting budget support, but there were just kind of differences across. They love to compare, and then you might even get more honest answers about how they feel about previous assignments and how they feel about current assignments, right? So because they're less embedded in it all the time. So I think it is worth asking some open-ended questions that pull on that previous experience as well.
All right, thanks. It's a shame that Simone's not here, but I'm going to try to channel her for a second and suggest that maybe in the survey you would want to look at whether bypass is an option in reaction to the different vignettes rather than suspending aid. So I think she is doing some survey work on that already, but I think it would be another possibility is bypass sort of an intermediate step. So at the more low level, the scandals, do they do that? And it's just the high level ones that lead to aid suspension. So I guess we've gone for a little more than an hour. If any of the discussants have anything else to add, now would be the time. If not, we'll give Haley the final couple of minutes to respond. All right, Haley, I guess the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I mean, these are all really great suggestions, and if I decide to field something, I will probably be coming back to you and asking for your advice and input, and maybe asking you, hey, do you want to work on this with me? But I think that these are all really interesting things for me to explore. Just in kind of last thoughts to some of these. I think this question of kind of slippage between hawks and between individuals that are then, you know, at donor agencies is a really important one, and something I think a lot about because, you know, I spent a lot of the time in the field, but of course I also spend some time at headquarters, and there's so much variation between different institutions and different donor agencies, and I think it's actually something that we lack a lot of information comparatively. So I think a lot of people have individual knowledge about how it works within one or two donor agencies, but we kind of lack comparative knowledge about how that looks abroad. And I think it's a really important question. These questions about in terms of this different scenarios and also using the idea of comparisons, I think you're both exactly right. So I mean, the average posting is somewhere between 2 to 4 years, and I see that in the survey. So the average time that they've been in the field is like just over 2 years. And I also find when I talk to people, they love to compare about, well, when I was in Afghanistan or when I was in Peru or when I was here. And I think you're also very right to point out that they might be more honest about previous assignments, right? Because they're less embedded. So I think that's a really great suggestion. Joe, these questions about kind of what the incumbent says and no fraud, I think those are also, again, really good suggestions, because that would allow me to test out what the knowledge is. And I was thinking that I hadn't really responded to the comment that you made earlier, which I took to be a really important one, right? I think that it is true. I'm kind of assuming that to some degree that political transgressions, there's a base level of knowledge, but although in the survey, right, I did, or in the list experiment, I said whether it's suspected, right? And I did that because we don't generally know, right? So even if everyone kind of knows that that's what happened, there sometimes is this difference in knowledge. But I took your points to be that there's actually a lot of variation on that. And sometimes there is a very general consensus among donor agencies, and other times there's not. And I think being able to play that out is important in terms of actually how it works on the ground, but also for this easy being able to tease out between strategic and institutional incentives. So I'll have to think through that a little bit more. Sarah, the starting with in-depth interviews, I think it's a good point, and I'm going to be in the field some more this year, so it's also something that I can go back to. I was originally actually inspired to do some work on this because I was in Uganda following this massive aid suspension of budget support. And what people were telling me is, okay, well, and because one thing I kept asking, well, why did we see so much collective action in this case? Like, why were donors? Because usually what happens when you have political transgressions is some donors suspend and some don't. And there's oftentimes some contestation between donors, and there's some kind of infighting actually between different donor agencies on what their response would be. But in this particular case, the response was so strong and there was so much collective action among the groups. And so I was often asking that. And the responses I were getting were, well, you know, we had this high level of trust in this particular institution and even with this particular individual. And then that trust was violated. And then this was all compounded by the fact that this was happening during the financial crisis, and it was Irish money, and Irish, you know, the Irish government was in crisis at the moment. And so people back home in Dublin were writing in papers about, well, how could we be wasting our aid? And so I think that in many ways, my experience has informed some of these types of questions. And I think it's a good idea to go back and just ask people some more systematic things to inform anything that I might do in the future on this. So I would just say thank you very much. I have a lot of things to think about, and I really appreciate your time.
Okay.
Thank you for an interesting discussion.
Thanks.
All right, so I'd like to thank everyone as well for showing up. I think your participation makes it very worthwhile and productive. So thanks again.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah, thanks, Ray.